All right, I think we're going to get started here. Hi, everybody. I am Celeste Lecomte, and I work at ProPublica, working on the business team there. And we are going to be talking about new product development in newsrooms today. So I want to start with a brief story, which is before I worked on the business side of media, I was a business reporter. And I reported a lot on innovation issues. So I interviewed many startups, and typically, one of the questions that I used to ask them all the time was, who are your customers going to be, and why will they give you their money? You may have a brilliant idea, but unless you have a product that somebody actually wants to buy, you don't really have a business. So as I started working more on the business side of media organizations, it occurred to me that we don't always do a very good job of asking this question of our own industry. Who are our customers and why will they give us their money? So as pretty much everyone here knows, I'm sure, the customers that we've depended on to give us their money for a long time, both our readers or viewers and our advertisers, are increasingly deciding not to give us their money. So I think that this is why we're at a moment in time in which we're starting to look at what are new products that our industry and that our companies can develop that people are willing to pay for. Whether it's new kinds of advertising products that people are willing to pay for, whether it's new forms of content that are drawing different audiences that advertisers would like to meet with, whether it's tools that are coming out of the newsroom that we think our peers might purchase, or whole new customer bases that we haven't thought about in the past. So I've asked our panelists to talk a little bit about some of the things that they've been working on to try to address this problem, and particularly to focus on things that are coming out of the newsroom, rather than more sort of strategic or business level initiatives, things that are really being generated by journalists themselves. So I think we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll let people talk about it. Does anybody want to start? All right, then we'll just go down the row here, I think.
I was just going to say, should we start with the definition of product?
Sure, that works for me.
Or should we start with the definition of who we all are?
Yeah. Oh. Well, I thought maybe we could you could introduce yourselves as you go.
Okay.
But that's fine.
Okay, I'm Madalika Sika. I am most recently, I was executive editor of Mike, which I just left. Prior to that, I was at NPR, where I was executive editor for news, and before that, executive producer for their morning radio show. Morning Edition, and prior to that I had an even longer time in network television, so I've run the gamut across all platforms. My sort of observations and insight on this issue are going to be dictated today mostly by the fact that I was in public media for a long time. For those of you unfamiliar with public media in the United States, it's free to the public. We never charge for any of our content. And it is funded by a combination of dollars from grants from the government, not a license fee like you have in many European countries, including Britain, philanthropic support, and something we call in the public media world underwriting, which you may be familiar with as advertising. The reason it's not called advertising is because there are very strict rules around the kind of language you can use in underwriting spots for public media. So, a Toyota ad that they would have across multiple news organizations probably wouldn't pass muster on public radio, so you'd have to create one just for us. So that's a bit of the background. And when we look at creating products, I think mostly for most of us in a for-profit world, we're talking about things that can be monetized. Public media is not averse to monetizing some things, but it's usually based from the journalism that we've done. So it just occurred to me thinking about this today that many years ago, NPR actually produced a lot of thematic CDs, which we would sell at the NPR store. So CDs built around great story, evergreen stories about dogs, or well, maybe not dogs, but evergreen stories around, art or culture or books. Haven't got to the watermelon yet, but I'm sure actually somebody I saw said at NPR, the question would be, how did they have 690 rubber bands at BuzzFeed? For those of you who don't know what we're talking about, we can talk about watermelons later. But in terms of product, I think the big challenge in any newsroom, whether you're for-profit or a public media organization or a nonprofit, is the notion of even discussing making a product. Some of us have been in journalism long enough to know that if you were discussing business and the business of your company, you were a horrible, unethical journalist. And how could you even think about such a thing? Because somehow magically you would do your brilliant journalism and not have to worry about how it's paid for, and that really wasn't your problem. Obviously, the whole industry has been turned upside down. I think as a journalist operating in today's environment, you're derelict in your duty if you do not think about the business side. You don't have to be fully involved, but you have to be aware of it. And come on, we're reporters. How can you live in a world where you watch the whole world economy turning upside down and you think somehow you are not going to be affected by it? So I think that that's something that everyone should be thinking about. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges in a newsroom, in thinking about creating a product. I think people just don't think that way, and they think it's not their job. I prefer to think about, yes, you know what, we know what people like about us. How are we going to double down on it? So in public media, we've created apps. I know most news apps are free, although some have paid content. That would be the equivalent of a product that I think would come out of technology, but the mistake people make is they don't include editorial. NPR had two great apps, the NPR News app and NPR One, which is labeled as a sort of Netflix for public radio, that NPR One would be able to figure out the things you liked and then basically programmed it by learning from you what you listened to, what you passed on, what you thumbs up. And it's a great idea and a great product. And the thing that made it even better for the public radio system was that it could be localized. So we in the national at DC create an NPR One with NPR produced products. But if you're a station in Nebraska, there would be an opportunity for you to localize it for your audience. So if you're a listener listening to NPR One in Nebraska, you would hear an NPR News newscast at the top, and then something localized for you. Great idea, brilliant product. It operated in the digital media side for a long time before there were editorial people sitting at the table. And what I observed, I wasn't on the digital media side, but what I observed as editorial started getting in, it became a much more valuable, useful, interesting product, so that when it actually hit the world in beta, the reaction was, oh my God, this is great. This has turned the potential for me to listen to NPR upside down. And I think that's a great example of where you have brilliant technologists, brilliant engineers, but you needed the newsroom to be part of it so that you could optimize it for the people that we're all serving. And I think that any news organization that is thinking about products and thinking about contents and silos, engineering and media, engineering and design and product in one place and never interacts with editorial is probably going to have a much harder slog.
Yeah, I think, Tom, this is a great...
I think that's my cue, because I think the kind of background to this whole discussion, particularly for those of us in incumbent news organizations. So I'm Tom Standage, I'm deputy editor at The Economist, and we were founded in 1843 to campaign against the Corn Laws and in favor of free trade. So we're like an old media organization. And product development is hard anyway, but we make it even harder for ourselves in old-fashioned news organizations because we have this tradition, for very good reasons, of a distinction between the editorial side and the business side. And you have the editorial side over here who write the stories, and then you have the business side over here, and they sell the ads and they sell the subscriptions. And you keep them apart from each other. And we have this church-state divide, we have Chinese walls, call it whatever you like. there was a very good reason we had that for a long time. And the healthiest news organizations at the moment, I think, are the ones that have the strongest church-state divide. But the problem is that the stronger that divide is, the harder it is to do product development. So the distinction has gone from being an asset to being a liability. And I think if you're going to build a new product, you have to take into account the editorial perspective, the commercial perspective, and the technology stroke product perspective. And you have to have all of those things together. And what we have done in media organizations is built a wall between two of the departments that need to be part of that discussion. And we see this across the board. It's really, really hard to develop digital stuff because usually in a newspaper or a news magazine or any kind of old-fashioned incumbent news organization, you have a bunch of technology people and they report to the CTO and they don't report to editorial. And then you say, well, let's put some developers in the newsroom and let's have some editorial stuff. But then, well, hang on a minute, they report to the editor and then the developers want to use this JavaScript framework and then the other developers in the other side of the Chinese wall want to use a different JavaScript framework and they're all checking in code to the same. I mean, it's a nightmare. How do you deal with this? So I think it's hard enough anyway, but in our industry, it's even harder because we have this tradition of building these walls. Now, Erin is going to tell us about how the great advantage that startup news organizations have is that they don't have to have that division. They can work much more like a tech firm. What I've been doing at The Economist is I've been looking at the startups and I've been looking at the digitally native news organizations. And I've also just been looking at straightforward tech startups and saying, how can we do product development more like they do it? And for a while, the way we would do it was a sort of skunkworks model. So with Espresso, which was an app that we launched at the end of 2014, it's been going for a bit less than 18 months now, but it was basically my idea. I said, look, this is how I think the editorial model should work. We need a smartphone native product. I prototyped it myself. I proposed what the commercial model should be, and I took it to the board and said, we should do this. And they said yes, and we did it. We did it as an internal startup, which was great, but it meant that that model isn't really sustainable. You can't do an internal startup every time you want to make a product. It's got to be a business as usual process. So we learned a great deal from doing that product, but we also learned that that was not the way to do it. In particular, what we learned was that the newsroom is only going to sign on to a new product if they think the idea came from the newsroom, if it came from editorial. If you have a commercial person that goes to the newsroom and says, we want to make this new product and you guys are all going to make content for it, they're not going to buy into it. So the weird thing is that means that the product development has to come from the editorial side. The ideas have to come from the editorial side, or at least they have to involve people on the editorial side. But the commercial and technical people who are going to make those products happen don't report to the journalists. So this is the big problem. Journalists can come up with a great idea. They could go to the CTO and say, I should build this. And the CTO can say, well, I think that's stupid. So how do you fix that? The way we've ended up doing it at The Economist, and our kind of lesson from Espresso, was that I got given the new product development division. So I got given a dual role, that I'm the deputy editor and I'm in the editorial pyramid and I still write stuff. So this week's cover about Mark Zuckerberg being a Roman emperor is my fault. At the same time, the new product development division was given to me, and it has a budget and a mandate to make stuff, and they are on the commercial side, and that way I have the authority to make things happen on that side of the fence. And I think if you look at incumbent news organizations, this is becoming an increasingly popular model. You see this at the Washington Post. I'd be very interested to hear what the Guardian version of this is. But I think you need to have these kind of hybrid people who are given the permission to roam on both sides of the Chinese wall. But just to go back to my original point, I think the really important thing is we do need to maintain that distinction between editorial and commercial. We don't want to compromise our editorial independence, but we need to find ways to have windows or holes in the Chinese wall. We need to decide what the rules are that allow people to roam, decide who the people are who are going to be allowed to roam, and then we need to let them get on with it and develop these products. Now let's hear from a startup.
So my name is Erin Miller, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Discourse Media, which is a small independent newsroom. We have 8 full-time people working for us in Vancouver in Canada. So I'm representing the little guy on the stage. And one of the things when we were talking about this earlier that came up was, I feel like one of the things that has led us to to developing products. I wouldn't even have called it that until only a few months ago when I started to recognize it as being that. I'm a journalist. I came out of working in large organizations before founding Discourse Media. And one of the reasons is that we really don't have that tradition or culture of church and state in our organization. In fact, we have no culture at all 2 years ago, so we got to build it up from scratch, which I think was a real advantage. So just to tell you a little bit more about Discourse for context, it was founded by journalists who all came out of more legacy incumbent media, I like that term, and we were all at a point in our careers where we were feeling more and more frustrated, in part because of struggling to access the resources that we needed in order to do really in-depth reporting about issues. And this was happening at a time that the advertising model was eroding in Canada, and there was a lot of cuts happening in the newsroom. So we came together to say, all right, we need to start an organization that will allow us to do this. And in Canada, so our model is not at all based on advertising or subscription. And we don't, while we function a lot, like we're a mission-driven organization, we function a lot like the nonprofits like ProPublica, we don't have the same philanthropic environment. So there's tax barriers to foundations supporting startups like ours. So we basically had the pressure on us to develop earned revenue models from day one. And we were coming at this as journalists first, not business people. So all of our ideas are coming directly out of the newsroom, and it was never seen as any kind of tension there. So that's sort of the context to how we think about this. And so our business model is essentially premised on the idea that the process of in-depth reporting, whether that's data-driven reporting or solutions reporting or investigative work, those are the sorts of things that we're always playing in on big complex issues, is extremely resource intensive. And that was the kind of work that we wanted to be doing. And yet we felt that when the one thing that we were producing out of that really in-depth process and building up that expertise was just an article or a video or whatever the actual content product for a general audience was, that was actually only capturing a thin sliver of the value in that process, and that we were leaving a lot of value on the table, all of that stuff that's in the margins of your notebook when you're reporting, or the stuff that gets left on the cutting room floor. And while that might not be appropriate value to a general audience with our media partners that we were working with, there is a lot of value in that for different sorts of audiences. So we began by thinking, all right, if we only consider the article we're producing that we're going to sell to another media outlet or that we're going to distribute in whatever way as one product, what are all the other products that we might be able to spin out of this core process and this expertise that we've built up? And how might we monetize that? Which audiences might that be appropriate to? So we're always thinking that way, and all of the journalists in our team that's part of the way that they're thinking. So it's very much part of our process. So just 3 quick examples of how we actually do this. One is, so we do a lot of data work, and often we don't sell our data. We have an open data value that's a core part of our values. But we find that one of the value adds that we bring to that is creating interactives and news interactives and design that really make complex issues more understandable, and that's a really valuable expertise and skill set for many, many different industries, not just journalism. So whenever we're developing one of these apps, we ask, okay, can we customize this for another audience? And one of the apps that we developed last year that was really, really successful was called the Cost to Commute Calculator, and it was for a news project about a transportation referendum in Vancouver that was very regional, local story that allowed you to plug in your commute, and then it would compare the cost to yourself and to society. It was a full cost accounting exercise of cycling versus walking versus driving that put a price on carbon and put a price on your wait time and all of those things. And it was localized for Vancouver. But then what we were able to do after that project was finished is repackage that, and we marketed it to municipalities where we could put in their data to customize it to their city, and we just added a little bit of their fonts or whatever, and this has now become a tool that municipalities use to encourage people to use more active transportation modes. So that's just one example of kind of how we're thinking, and we often will do that in other ways. So a project that we're doing right now called Power Struggle, which is a global partnership with 10 media outlets around the world. We're all collaboratively reporting on how energy poverty impacts our local communities and some of the solutions that are emerging to deal with that in a time of climate change. So we're working with 10 different journalists that are developing great expertise out of that, and we said, what else can we do with that other than produce the content that our media partners are publishing? And we developed a couple of talks that really show the human story, how it's connected to this global issue, and an exhibit based on the photography that the journalists all did collaboratively. They created this beautiful photo essay. And that's something now we're marketing to event organizers, and it'll be coming out in 8 different events across Canada as a great thing that's also delivering on our mission, because it's advancing the public discourse about energy poverty and the solutions that we might be able to do together globally. So there's just 2 examples of how we think, and the journalists love being part of product development. It's fun. So there you go.
Hello. There, hi. So I'm Aaron Pilhofer. I wear 2 hats at The Guardian. I am executive editor of digital, which means, in our case, visual journalism. So that's interactive graphics, photo, interactive documentary. And then as of October of last year, I stepped in as interim chief digital officer, which is product, technology, our entire product line, and enterprise technology and UX. And so while that seems like a huge leap, it actually wasn't as big a leap for me, because I've had a dual report to the newsroom and to the commercial side, going back to my previous position at the New York Times, where I ran basically a product technology team in the newsroom. At the time when we created it in 2007, we didn't know what it was. It took me several years to realize, because we weren't making graphics, we weren't really, doing things that, were obviously this or that. And it finally dawned on me, Jesus Christ, I'm running a product team. We were launching websites. We launched, for better or worse, a big Olympics package that we white labeled to my current employer, among others, for 3 successive Olympics. And so I've had a lot of experience kind of going back and forth across that wall. And I completely agree with everything that's been said to this point, that is, to my mind, the biggest fundamental problem in traditional legacy, whatever you want to call it, news organizations right now, is that newsrooms are just, for whatever reason, not fully involved in the product development process. And I think part of the reason, at least for the newsrooms I've worked in, and for, I think, at least the peer set that I would look at, the Washington Post and the traditional news organizations, is that for literally hundreds of years, our organizations really have had to think about a product, which is to say, a printed newspaper, and perhaps some ancillary businesses, but fundamentally product meant the newspaper. And so then when you start thinking about developing new products or trying to develop new revenue streams, these are not muscles that news organizations have flexed particularly. The other problem is that product development in news organizations is a relatively recent phenomenon. Just even having product teams in newsrooms, particularly in the UK, which it's a very, very new thing. And what it meant to be a product manager in a news organization is very different than what it means to be a product manager in, say, a tech company. In a lot of cases, if you're the product manager at a tech company or at General Mills and you're producing breakfast cereal, whatever it is, you own that product, soup to nuts. You might even own the P&L for that product. You might have revenue responsibilities. You might have that much control over the product. In a news organization, because of this very necessary division between editorial and commercial, you're never going to have that amount of power. You're never going to have that amount of authority. You're never going to be able to say, you 5 journalists, you stop what you're doing. We're going to have to develop this new app, and now you're going to be writing for that. You're never going to have that. As a product manager, your role is more, it ends up being a lot of sort of consensus building It ends up being sort of the connective, I describe it as the connective tissue between editorial and commercial. And the problem is there's just not enough connective tissue between editorial and commercial. And that absolutely has to change, and has to change very, very quickly for obvious reasons. So I think I'm just going to leave it at that right now. I can relay to you some of the successes and failures of developing products out of Newsroom. And I think probably my role here is going to be more a little bit on the doom and gloom side with a little bit of hope. That newsrooms, while they should be involved, I believe, fundamentally in product development, having newsrooms lead product development, I think is probably problematic, and I can describe to you a few reasons why that is, painfully from personal experience why that is. And I worry that news organizations are just not moving fast enough to kind of bring those sides together, so I'll just probably leave it at that.
So a lot of the products that everyone has talked about have focused on very technology-heavy things, mobile apps, embeddable, white-labeled things. And I think most experiences that you see newsrooms trying, things like new podcasts or newsletters, are not very technology-intensive, but do actually give some training wheels, maybe, for what that new product development experience is like. Do you have examples of sort of how those have come up through maybe more an individual writer saying, I want to do a newsletter, can you help me figure out how to monetize it? Or
we've just done this with a newsletter which came out of the newsroom, and the newsroom said, look, this is stupid. Everyone else has, the Washington Post has like 70 newsletters, and we had 2. We could probably do with more newsletters. We don't even have a daily newsletter. So the news desk said, we're going to make a daily newsletter. And they started doing it with MailChimp, and it was great. And then the commercial side said, no, our ad serving solution doesn't work with that. You have to use this horrible system over here, which is like using DOS, only worse, right? It was awful. And then the newsroom said, we're not using that. It's terrible. So someone in the newsroom built a script which automatically generates all the stuff. And then the technical team go, you can't use that script. We haven't validated it. It could have security problems. And so we had to kind of get everyone together and say, look, folks, we're doing this newsletter. We need to all agree on how we're doing it. And it's a horrible platform, but we understand we have to use it. And so you have to, connective tissue is exactly right. And the other expression I use here is you have to have kind of bumblebee people who go around and they know what's going on, and they are not just allowed to talk, but they actually do talk to all the different people in the. So we've added a couple of people in the past few months who are formally allowed to roam across the wall and know what's going on and go to meetings. Because we actually have the editorial, The Economist, we have the editorial in one building in London, and we have everyone else, commercial and technology, in a different building, across town. I mean, that's how serious the church-state divide is. So having people who are allowed to go up and down the Jubilee line on the tube between these two and actually see what's going on. But anyway, so you're right. A newsletter, on the face of it, it's really simple. It's 4 paragraphs a day with some links and some pictures. That's the way we do it. And it turned out to be much more complicated to get everyone rallied around it. But once you do that, you start to kind of think in a different way, and you start to kind of, the people who went through that process will now, next time they want to do something, go, okay, these are the people I need to go and talk to about the ads. These are the people I need to go and talk to about the technology.
I feel like, Marilika, you had something similar that we were talking about before the panel.
I mean, you raised podcasts as an example of a product that obviously is the fashionable thing to do right now. NPR, obviously, audio first, always has been. In some senses was a leader, and in other senses sometimes a little bit behind. But I'm sure most of you are familiar with This American Life, which is not an NPR product. Neither is Radiolab, but they come out of the public radio system. It's very convoluted, and if anyone wants to talk to me about the public radio system, I will try and explain it, but we'll have to take some aspirin beforehand. Anyway, Radiolab and This American Life are examples of shows that came out of stations because the structures in NPR and in public radio were just too complicated to get it done. And I think public media in particular, probably in any country, is really risk averse. And that's a whole other problem we can talk about. But we launched, just a few months before I left NPR, we launched a new podcast called Invisibilia, which I'm proud to say did very well, but it was not without difficulty. And the first task was editorial, and what we wanted to do with the reporters who host the show, and their lead editor, who is a genius, they felt that there was an area of science and mental health coverage that wasn't being dealt with. We had excellent reporters, great storytellers. We wanted to do something around that was produced by NPR. We wanted the next Serial or the next This American Life to actually come from NPR. So basically what it involved was me hiding them away in the newsroom. I mean, we incubated it editorially for a long time, 12 to 18 months, which can cause friction in a newsroom when people are like, where are those people? Why aren't they on the air? Why are we doing this? It's completely untested. And we waited till we had about 2 shows roughly before we started talking to everybody else in the distribution side and sales and everything else. So it took a long time to get going, but once we felt really good about editorially, which for me was the most important thing, we needed to lead editorial, start getting everyone on board, station relations, PR, everybody else. It had a mammoth, very coordinated effort of all of NPR behind it when we introduced it to the world. And that's why you have to be talking to everybody, because there were skill sets that we didn't have in the newsroom that we needed in order to make sure this product had the best chance possible of launching and making a splash, which it did. It was released as a podcast, which got underwriting, which was a wonderful achievement by the salespeople because it was a product we'd never done before and nobody had heard it, and lots of people are usually like, well, let's see what it sounds like and how it does. But this was sort of on the strength of the quality that we put in front of them. And stations picked it up as a show as well, and more than 310 stations picked it up, the largest ever launch of a new show from NPR. It got remarkable pickup in the press. I think people forget that part too, if you don't have your communications team who are out there letting people know about it. We got a lot of support within the podcast world through word of mouth, and it had millions of downloads. So I think that was an example of, for me, editorial leads. We knew what we wanted to do. We thought we had something. We got insight from people around us, came up with something that, hey, take a listen, trust us, it's different. It's a science show with 2 women who host it. That was a big selling point for me. But it takes a village, and I think that every newsroom needs to understand that it does take a village. You have to all be on the same team at the same level by the time you want to push that thing out there.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to folks here to ask their own questions. So start thinking about what you might want to know. So for the errands, I have a question for you guys, actually, both of you. The products that you guys are talking about around newsletters and apps and new podcasts, those are often catering to the same customers that we've had in the past, but trying to find new ways to serve them. It's our regular readers, it's the people who are our core customers, it's advertisers, giving them new ways that they are actually willing to give us money.
I actually would push back on that.
Okay.
And I think particularly in the podcast world for public radio, it's to bring another audience, or an audience that you lost not because your work wasn't as good, but time shifting. I mean, People time shift, their lives change, and if I could do it when I wanted to, then I would listen to more public radio. So I think it actually brings more.
That's fair.
I think it has the opportunity to bring more audience. It's not it's not a zero-sum game. It's not like, if you focus on podcasts and you're leaving behind terrestrial radio. I don't think that at all.
Sure. I'll clarify that I mean specifically in terms of the revenue models for both of them. They're sort of tapping into the same basic idea. And I think the two of you are talking about a very sort of different approach to how you actually use new products to generate revenue in terms of the white labeling the Olympics piece and some of the work that you're doing, Erin, in Vancouver. So if you guys could maybe talk about some of the ways that you come up with that new revenue idea for new products, that'd be interesting.
Sure, I'll jump in. So one of the products that we're currently developing that we haven't monetized yet, but its first iteration will live in the world in a couple of weeks, is called Deep Dive. And this came very much out of, your last question was about what products are coming from the journalists. And this came out of a number of our journalists who were working on one of these big systemic, complex investigations, going through the editing process. And if anybody who's written a feature or had to edit down a long piece, whether that's audio or whatever, you often create that file of the stuff that you cut, and you put it in there to convince yourself, oh, these babies, these gems I've created, I'm going to use them again, and you'd never open that file again. Who's experienced that? Yeah. And the reality is that a lot of that information is extremely valuable. It's just, it doesn't work in the form, or it's bogging down the narrative, or whatever it happens to be. So, so Deep Dive came out of that, and that was a recognition that not only do journalists produce a lot of expertise that is valuable to a different sort of audience, but we also have a skill set that is really valuable. And the skill set of being able to go into a landscape and figure out how it works and how the money flows and who are the players and all of that piece is really, really valuable to a lot of people who are working in those systems. Actually, one of our inspirations for this was The Economist's intelligence unit that is, doing research and making that available and marketing that to business, a business community that can use that in different ways. So Deep Dive for us is we've built these communities of interest and these audiences around particular issues. A lot of the most engaged audiences are people who are working on trying to address the challenges that we're writing about, we've found, and they have a real need to understand the issues in the landscape. So we've created a product that wishes to be for the civil sector and for the nonprofit sector what the intelligence unit at The Economist is for the business sector, and this is something that we're hoping to monetize and working on exactly what that looks like. And it provides deeper data sets that academics want access to. There's briefs about how these issues are particularly applying in different regions. Like each issue has a very different mix of content, but it's something that we want to be applying to all our projects. So that's just one example.
Yes, I've been involved in, I guess, quite a few product development initiatives that had a revenue component to them. Almost all of them failed, which makes you wonder how I am even in the job I'm in. But let's just set that aside for a moment. So the project that I mentioned, we talked about, out of the newsroom, we decided we did this big Olympics project every year. It involves a ton of data. It involves a ton of code. And we made that, I made that quite natural leap that, well, if we're doing all this work to make this, and we could make it do about that much more work and turn it into something we could sell, that seems like a win-win. And by the way, if just a pro tip, that never works. It is never just that much more work, and in the end, if you do not have the company, and I mean all of the company, from sales to marketing to PR, all the way down, fully committed to this, to supporting you, you will find yourself in the unenviable position we did, where one of people on my team were actually, and this is not a joke, we're developing product brochures for the Olympics product that we did over 3 successive Olympics. And it made a little bit of money, but not a ton of money. And if we had taken a little bit of a smarter, if I had taken a little bit more of a smarter, upfront, a harder look at whether or not this is a market we actually had a chance of competing in, we never would have done it. Or we would have done it very differently. Or we would have done it without revenue as being a key component to it. We would have done it maybe as a collaborative thing. Some of the other products, so to go back to the definition of product, I think my definition of a product might be slightly different. I would say that a product in my mind is a thing that solves a problem, that addresses a need. And sometimes sometimes that need is something that people would pay for. And sometimes that need is something that people don't have to pay for, or that you can find other ways to sustain it. So I think the sustainability piece of product development is key. And sometimes sustainability is about revenue, and sometimes it's about collaboration. So another project that I worked on, which is Document Cloud, which has been able to sustain itself, which is, I think, has been relatively successful as a product, but it's not truly about revenue. It's been more about collaboration. So that's the other side. The third thing that I've been involved in is that where, again, I don't think this didn't quite work as intended, but I think there were reasons for it, and I think in the end, it was a real learning experience for everyone, because I think this is back at the New York Times. It was a project called NYT Now, which is an app, and it was meant to do exactly what you were describing, which is create a lower cost, entry-level product way into the New York Times that would be at a lower price point, that would potentially attract a different, younger audience. And I think it's a wonderful product. I still use it every single day. I don't even have the New York Times core app. I'm a subscriber, but I don't even have the core app on my phone. That's how much I love NYT Now, and it's not just because I worked on it. I think it's an amazing product. But it failed financially, I think, for various reasons, because I think this goes back to what I said earlier, which is developing new product. It launched at $8 a month. $8 a month for a news app is insane. $8 as a single purchase out of the App Store is insane, much less $8 a month. So, I mean, it was a delusional price point that I think ultimately ended up killing the product as a driver of revenue. And now what you see the New York Times doing as a result of that, they've brought together new product, editorial, they're much more joined up. It is not the sort of huge division that you saw when I was there. And I think you're going to start to see over the next year or so a succession of new products coming out of the Times that are really going to be, we're all going to be looking at going, head slap, I wish we'd have thought of that.
All right, I think we'll go to the audience and take some questions if people are out there. Is there someone with microphones? I'm not sure. All right, you may just have to project. Oh, there's somebody in the back here. Go ahead.
May I ask, you spoke about old-fashioned companies, and I'm sure you're aware that there are many...
Hold on a second, she's going to bring you a mic.
Yep. I was talking about old-fashioned companies, and I'm sure that you know that there are also smaller companies that are equally old-fashioned. How do you think that these companies can develop and embrace these new products? Does it have to do with ideas, with people, with the Chinese wall that you mentioned, or a little bit of everything?
I think it's a little bit of everything. I think the main thing is to say, so we're developing a new app at the moment, and the starting point for it was, if we were a startup and we had access to all of the Economist content free, what would the app look like? So force yourself to think, what would a startup do in this situation? And publishers there's another, I talked about the church-state divide, there's another big problem publishers have, which is that they think that product development is something that, we're used to. When you launch a new magazine or a new supplement to a newspaper, you spend 6 months iterating inside, and maybe you do a few focus groups, but basically you design it, and then you launch it, and it stays the same, and you just change the content. And this is how publishers think about technology as well. They think you launch an app, and they have this delusion that they don't understand. You never finish software. It's never done. And they think you launch it, and then the way you make the product better is by changing the content. And yes, of course we change the content because we're publishers, but they don't understand that we're competing against tech companies that are iterating on the product. They're using the analytics. So the main piece of advice, I think, is just look at what the startups are doing and steal from them. And look at how they structure their business, look at how they think about product development, look at how they improve their products. And that's what we all need to be doing. We need to be thinking in much more of a startup mindset. And obviously the startup news organizations have a head start because they are startups themselves. You have small teams, it's clear what everyone's doing, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really, really hard for big companies to kind of get into that mindset. And it's particularly hard for publishers, as I say, for these two reasons, which is they think iteration is content iteration and not product iteration, and they have the church-state divide. But if we could become aware of those problems, those hurdles that are in front of us, and jump over them, then it is possible to do it.
Yeah, I actually think maybe we're saying the same thing, maybe we're not, but I actually think content iteration is one of the fundamental problems today. One of the hardest things to do if you're a product manager in a traditional news organization. I mean, imagine what happens, right? You have this entire newsroom, in our case, over 700 journalists producing content 24 hours a day in 3 offices around the world. And everything they are producing is, even if it's meant for online, basically newspaper shaped, right? It's an article and an image or multiple images. It's still newspaper shaped. And you're taking these newspaper shaped things and trying to fit them into digital shaped receptacles, and that is a recipe for mediocre product at best.
I totally agree, and I think that was the problem with with NYT Now,
which is
agree. NYT Now basically said the problem is that the New York Times is too long for any human being to read. So, you know, it's 300, 800 word articles every day. So we'll just give you 30 of them, and that'll be fine. And they're still 800 word articles. And it was interesting because I was doing Espresso at the same time as New York Times Now came out. And what I said for Espresso was putting these articles that we already write for print and we already write for the web into an app does not make it a smartphone product. Totally. We have to decide what is the content form, and we invented, you know, we call them chunks. They're 150 word articles. They still feel like The Economist, but so I totally agree with you on the content iteration. All I meant was that there is a sort of mistake, a trap for publishers, which is, of course we're changing the product every day. We're putting new content into it every day, and that doesn't count. I mean, you have to do that, but if you're competing against tech companies who are doing this too, then they are improving the product and changing the content every day, and it's not enough just to do the second thing.
And just to add to that, I think one of the challenges in newsrooms is people in newsrooms are the worst people about thinking about user experience. And, you know...
It's really depressing how many people just laughed.
It's true. You'd go to people and you'd say, you know, I mean, if I'd look at a story that was, you know, an 8-minute radio story, I'm producing a morning show where people want to just, you know what's happening and move along. And I'd be like, it's not that it's a bad story. It's not, doesn't work for this day part, right? That matters. I was like, do you have time to listen to an 8-minute story in the morning? No. And when you talk about moving to different platforms, or on demand, or time shifting, I was like, do you ever watch a drama live? No, I watch it when the kids have gone to bed and blah, blah, blah. I was like, well, why would you not think that our audience lives like that too? They are the absolute worst. It's so in our tunnel about we're doing this most brilliant, sacred thing and everyone must stop in their world to consume what we do. And I think that that is another real challenge when thinking about products. You have to not forget about the user. And I don't want this to be a blanket statement, but I think there are too many newsrooms where they just don't think about the user at all.
There was another question back here.
Okay, I hope this works. My name is Ezra Eamon. I'm the head of VRT Startup, and we're actually a kind of startup within the public broadcaster in Belgium. And we're just setting up a news lab on the news floor. And it's a mixed team of journalists and developers and some external experts like analytics persons. And in my opinion, or in my experience, for the first month, there's like 2 speeds. You have like incremental innovation, all these journalists, they come up to you like, I would like an app too, or give me a newsletter. And then there's the developers and the guys who think ahead, who want to do really disruptive things. And I was wondering, what's your experience and what's the best way to go?
Maybe I'll jump in first and try to jam what I wanted to say before into your question as well and build on it. I think there's been an enormous amount of innovation done. We're still not finished yet, of course, around tech, around platform, around delivery platform, and God knows, advertising, ever more a new form of sponsored content or et cetera. Where I think there's a huge opportunity is to be thinking in a disruptive manner about journalism itself. Like what you said, Aaron, really resonates with me, and not just the form of the storytelling, but the practice itself. And as a small organization, I think that that's where we can add a lot of value, because we're never going to compete with 700 journalists cranking out content 24 hours, but we can, by pausing for a moment, thinking about the user, and really asking, what is the point of this journalism? What are we trying to achieve with this? What value does this have, and to whom? And then creating something that is responding to that need in a genuinely new way. I think that we can cut through the noise with some really, really neat projects, and I think we've seen that happen in the last few years. So I would urge you to think not incrementally about a new newsletter or anything, but asking the journalists, like, hey, let's blow up your process for a second. Let's rethink some of the core values here. Let's explore with new relationships with the audience. I've had a lot of really great ideas coming out of some of the engagement panels here, for example, and asking what are some of the new things that we can do with our practice itself. It's not as fancy. There's not as many tech people involved, but necessarily, although there can be. But there's so many new opportunities now with all the tech tools that we have and all of the new opportunities and storytelling methods. So, yeah.
Part of the problem, too, I think, is just the word innovation, actually. And I think we all would have, I think, pretty specific definitions of what that is. But I'm not sure that that's universal across the industry right now. I think the word innovation is often used as a synonym for cool. That's really cool. That's innovative. And it's not. Innovation is a very specific thing. It means an incremental improvement in a process or a product that improves it in some measurable way. And notice I used the word measurable, okay? So that to me is innovation, right? And there's a lot of things that are cool. My team does a lot of things that are really cool, not innovative at all. They are awesome, not innovative. So innovation is often really boring, often really, really tedious and really, really boring. And that's good, actually, in the end. So you're talking about like creating a team, a skunk works, you know, the challenge with that is twofold. One is, why are you doing that? My first question to you is why? Why would you create such a team? What is your, what is your goal? And how are you going to know whether you've succeeded in that? So what is the purpose? And a lot of newsrooms create these kind of teams, and they put them in the corner, and they point to them like, you know, it's part of the tour. There's the cool kids over there. They're doing cool things. But are they really actually innovating? Are they improving the news product on a daily basis or a weekly basis in some measurable way? And so A, you need to be able to measure it. B, you need to know if embedded in that is knowing where you mean to go. So what's your strategy? How does this team help you achieve the strategy for the organization? And that's another problem with the kind of skunk works model, which I think is exactly the problem you ran into, which is, and that we have too, in many, many places, is that innovation can't just stay sealed in this hermetically sealed little environment. It has to be everybody's job. It has to be everybody's job, that's right. Or you end up in this situation where you have this kind of two-class newsroom, where there's all these people over here doing all the fun things, and all these people over here doing the hard work. But
I think the people who aren't doing it, for them that's a benefit, because they basically say, oh, thank God, I don't have to do that, because those people are doing it.
Yeah. So how do you change that culture in your newsrooms? I mean, I just started my job at ProPublica, and one of the things that I work on is new product development with our teams. And a lot of what I did when I got there was talk to all of the reporters, including the junior reporters, and learn about what they were working on and encourage them to come to me with new ideas. But, you know, that's like a very labor-intensive process. And if you're in a 700-person newsroom, how do you convince anyone on the floor that they can come to someone? If I'm, you know, a junior reporter at The Guardian and I have an idea, how do I get that idea heard and explored and then vetted as a right direction?
Well, I think, to go back to the question, I think you have to make the distinction between two. So I would disagree with you that innovation is always incremental. So our definition of innovation at The Economist, and this is the editorial definition, is it's new thinking that creates value. And that can be incremental or it can be disruptive, as we just heard. So I think you have to have a process, and if you look at what tech companies do, they have a process for incrementally improving the products that they have, and the news version of that is analytics with feedback. Right? So a lot of us have analytics, but where is the closing of the loop? Where does the advice? So we have a fantastic analytics team that don't just say, here are the numbers, folks. They say, here are the numbers, and this means we need to do more of this and less of this. We need to have prescriptions. So that's the kind of day-to-day incremental improvement part, and that means changing processes in the newsroom. But that's basically, the incremental part. And then you have the kind of disruptive bit, and you need to have, again, a process. You need to have a person you can go to, or a team, or whatever, that does innovation or makes new products, but it's a business as usual process to do that. So it's not every time someone has an idea, we do a skunk works around that idea. There has to be these people over here are the new product, team, and go and tell them, and they make 3 new things a quarter, or they evaluate 3, or whatever. But you have to make it a process that happens all the time and has a formal kind of, it's baked into the way the company works, instead of innovation being the exception. It has to be, what are the next 3 things we're doing? Where are we getting the ideas from? How will we tell if they've worked? Et cetera, et cetera. So I think you need to have 2 versions of that. And it sounds like your team in the newsroom, I don't know if they're doing the analytics and they're doing the new product development, but they're kind of different things, I think.
Here in the middle.
Hey, I'm Sylvia. I work at BBC News Labs. That's probably the kind of thing that you refer to as the cool kids in the corner, which actually does happen. It's true, we're even in a different building, and it's sometimes difficult to connect with the journalists. So we are a mix of data scientists and developers mostly, with a bit of journalism background as well. And we have one editorial person, but many things we do are kind of we just play around, and 90% or maybe 80% of the things we do never get out to the public. And I was wondering how early in this process of innovation or playing around with things should there be a business person involved, or a product person, or when do you start to call a thing a product?
Minute one.
Day 0.
Minute one.
Yeah.
But could it be that it's also, because sometimes I find in this phase that you don't have any boundaries and you can just play around. It gives you a lot of freedom, and this also makes new ideas happen.
But you just said that 80% of your ideas never get out, so...
Yeah, I was going to say,
20% do, so I wonder if...
Do they?
Is
That's
it
great.
worth it for
that?
that?
That's an incredible hit rate. I mean, I'm not arguing against R&D, which actually sounds more what you're doing 5-6 years down the road kind of work. Is that an accurate... Yeah. I'm not arguing against that. Product development isn't R&D, though. I think we're talking about a slightly different thing. I would say product development, and I think we all would agree, from minute 1, day 1, if it's not a collaborative effort among editorial, commercial, design, business, you name it, from the moment you go. And that was the NYT Now team, by the way. It included marketing and advertising, and everybody was there from the beginning. It was a small team, but we were all essentially co-equals on that team.
That's going to be your job, essentially, right?
Right. I was going to say, one of the things that that I think about a lot is that, business also needs to be doing this sort of like cycling through a bunch of ideas about how this might be a viable revenue opportunity, and what are the different kinds of ways that we could monetize what we're working on. And then it's not, I think there's a big trend in a lot of cool, not innovative, new news products where something great goes up online and then we slap an ad on it. And that's how we've decided to monetize it. And I think that can't be the only solution for a variety of reasons. So having business people involved early on in that sort of creative thinking, brainstorming process gives them the chance to come up with ideas other than like, well, we've got advertisers, we'll put that against it.
And I think just the other thing is having everyone involved on day 1 saves a hell of a lot of time. I mean, if you have every unit represented in your small working group or whatever it is, they're all coming with their perspective, and you can understand each other on the front end, as opposed to a few creative, innovative, whatever you want to call them, people coming up with something, oh, this is just the greatest thing, ever. And then you have to have a meeting with another unit who then bring their perspective. And then you have to have another meeting with the next unit. And you can't afford to be that slow, frankly. And you have to acknowledge that, everyone has a seat at the table that is important. If this thing is going to be the best thing ever, the people who are going to help make it a success were at the table on day 1.
But that doesn't mean you have to decide on what the product looks like or what the business model is on day 1.
Right.
And I think this is this is a tech industry thing, which I have had to persuade people, my colleagues, is, this is a feature, not a bug. When you're developing a new product, the classic tech industry thing is you look for product market fit. and you kind of want to make a really compelling product, and then you figure out the best way to monetize it. Now, that doesn't mean you don't think about monetizing it at all from the beginning. You have to be, saying, well, we could go this way, we could go that way, it could turn into this kind of product, it could turn into that kind of product. So you need to be thinking about that from the beginning. But pretending you know all the answers, and you know what the pricing is going to be, and you know what the business model is going to be from the beginning, is also, I think, a mistake. And if you look at how tech startups work, and again, I just say that's what we need to be doing. We need to be looking at how tech startups, successful tech startups, do things. And so yes, they do have the commercial people involved right from the beginning, but they're also willing to flex the product and flex the business model, and they don't pretend they have all the answers.
Is there another question in the audience? Here?
When the newsroom comes up with a product and the business side doesn't think it's monetizable, who wins?
Oh, this is the old sort of, divisive way of thinking. It should be, I don't know. I think you should. The newsroom should pitch the idea, and they should say, "We think this would be a great product." And you can do things like you can test products you could do, even without building it, you can prototype it, you can mock it up, you can show it to people. You could do these tests so cheaply online now. You could show a proposal for a product without even building it. And there are lots of startups that do this. They do this thing saying, we are building this product and sign up for early access. They haven't written a single line of code. All they're doing is seeing how many people sign up for it. And if 10,000 people sign up on the waiting list for a product that hasn't even been built yet, they know there's interest in it. So again, this is tech industry thinking. And so if you could show that there's demand for something before you've even built it, then that's a really compelling argument.
But one thing I think sort of looking at it that way is a little bit, in a newsroom, not every single thing is a product that is going to be a business success. We still, want to do the best journalism possible. Everyone says they don't want to, but they do want to win awards. There are units in the newsroom that are, in old terms might be considered loss leaders, but are so valuable to the brand and the work, and it is the work that they're doing work that is defining of the news organization. So I don't think that they would be considered losers or winners. You've got to have the right mix in your newsroom. So I think there are going to be some things that the newsroom comes up with that aren't going to work for a variety of reasons, but there are some things that they are going to come up with. And I think we need to not be so invested in every sort of single one. The most important thing is we get into the practice and the habit of actually talking to each other across the company. And to Aaron's very earlier point about if people aren't invested from the top to the bottom, it doesn't matter what you're doing on your floor. If from the CEO down, if there isn't that message of supportiveness, it's going to be a fool's errand.
I would also just bring this back to culture where we started and also say that I think as we've seen the traditional business models of media failing and yet we are continuing to produce content, that most of the time the newsroom does win that. There's tons of, if we consider every article that goes out a product, then there's tons of product being produced by the newsroom that is not being monetized. And so just to bring up a story that you told me yesterday, Celeste, is that you're working on monetizing data. And sometimes there are opportunities that have come up to you to basically create new data that somebody would pay for. But you're not going back to the journalists and saying, hey, can you create this? You are, even though you're sort of on both sides of that wall and you come from journalism and you have this business background as well, you respect that the newsroom needs to make editorial decisions and that you're working with what they're producing and they're still making those editorial decisions. So I think that's important. And then secondly, I don't think it would harm newsrooms from when we come up with an idea, pausing and doing some analysis around whether that is really valuable to our community. I think too often, even if we think about product development as story development in a story meeting, we come in, we pitch an idea to an editor. That idea I may have discussed with my friends over my dinner party over the weekend, and they were interested in it, and they're the same type of people as me. And I'm pitching it to my editor, who might be 10 years older than me, but is essentially from a similar background in class, and we decide internally, yes, this is a good idea, this is of value, but we're not actually pausing and looking out to our broader audience and asking, are we really serving our community? Are we really serving our society all the time? And I think we would benefit from being a little bit more critical as journalists like that.
So I just have, because this is exactly the conundrum we faced at the Times, right? So the answer to the question is who wins, commercial or editorial, if editorial has an idea. The answer is if commercial owns the means of production, commercial wins. Whether or not the editorial side bullies them into making the thing, they're going to do a shit job at it, and then they're going to say, see, I told you so, that's why you shouldn't be doing this, let us handle this from now on, thank you very much. And it'll take them 9 months to develop it, and nobody will be happy. If the newsroom has the ability to build these things on their own, and there is an editorial reason to do it, not just a commercial reason or no commercial reason whatsoever, then the newsroom wins. And we built a lot of those kinds of things, and sometimes the commercial side's even wrong. So we brought the commercial side very early on. One of the biggest projects we ended up doing was about the Oscars. The New York Times used to do an embarrassingly bad job on the Oscars. And the Oscars is basically like the Super Bowl to the New York Times, right? This is a huge project for us. And we built this huge ballot thing and this huge blog, and it was this epic project, and it was hugely successful. And the commercial side kind of looked at it and said, meh. That thing ended up earning millions in sponsorships over the years, actually. So sometimes they're wrong. So that's good too.
I'm going to take another question, but I also would like to ask about the time. I didn't bring a clock with me, so I don't know how we're doing.
It's 10 past 3.
10 past 3. Okay, we have a little bit more time, so if there are a couple more questions. In the back there.
Hi, Florian Stieglich from Neue Zürcher Zeitung from Switzerland. I worked there in a lab, and this team sort of transformed into more product development team, so I kind of understand what you're talking about this difference between those two approaches. But my question is, you said it's very important to do product development very user-focused, and you also said news organizations aren't very good in this, so I would like to hear some more about your approaches or process or methods and how you are iterating on these, on the methods and process.
I mean, I'll start on some of this. So at ProPublica, I was saying I do some new product development work, but prior to that, I have done consulting to other smaller news organizations on how to launch premium contents and subscription model businesses after working at GigaOM, helping launch the research business there. And one of the things that I think is extremely simple and often overlooked as a way to do this is to just talk to people. Like we're newsrooms full of reporters who are really good at asking questions. And you learn very quickly if you have an idea that you want to test with a set of people, you can find a similar audience to the one you think you're going to sell to and ask them a bunch of questions about the kind of thing you're thinking about and learn a ton about who those people are, what their interest is, what they value, where they have money that they're spending on something else that you could maybe transfer to your product or whatever that is. And you just can learn a ton from that. So I've been working at ProPublica on a lot of our health data that we use in our reporting and we make available for sale on our data store. And I'm looking to develop sort of new things that we could do with that. So I've been out talking to startups and companies and organizations that I think might be interested in doing new things with it, just to hear what's out there. And I think that's a really simple, low-cost way to approach new product development that can make huge strides towards this user experience piece.
I would add that I think talking is the most underrated activity in a newsroom, and Slack has made that much worse. I think actually talking to people in your newsroom, even one at a time, and also identifying the people who are interested and engaged and who will come along with you, and then you can show the sort of show and tell of how it works, and someone who has some success with something hopefully should breed a little bit of competition and for people to see it. Because a lot of times people just have they can't sort of imagine something completely new and how it would affect them, whether it's some grand product like an app or whether it's just using new tools. for reporting, you know, across any platform. So Twitter is a great example. It was very hard. A lot of people were slow at NPR to use Twitter. It's not the be-all and end-all. I happen to use it to get my news, but a lot of reporters are really good at using it as a reporting tool. And the way people consume their news now, you know, you don't have to reveal, you know, the full extent of your reporting in a big story at the end of the day. One of the reporters at NPR who's excellent at Twitter and using it as a reporting tool is the media reporter. That's handy. He's the media reporter. But he would, you know, put nuggets out during the course of the day, or sometimes with a story that was unfolding. He was on top of it all. And in the world of Twitter and media, which is a very sort of incestuous group, everybody saw that. Everyone could see that he's on top of this story. That's how you build your sources. And then you could go around the rest of the newsroom and you see how this works for him. Here are some things you can learn that would work for you. So I think that sort of show and tell part, and people seeing their own colleagues and peers trying and iterating and sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, is a really useful tool to help change the culture in a newsroom.
So product development, so product is not just a thing, it's also a process, it's a discipline. And so at The Guardian, we're trying to expand how we do product development across the organization. It used to happen in small pockets, and now we're trying to bring much more of the organization in. And so the methodology we use is probably, you know, you could call it some flavor of agile, lean, design thinking, user-centered design. That's pretty much the methodology we use to interrogate our users as to whether or not we're actually solving problems for them, whether this is a product they want, and whether it's something they might be willing to pay for. We're going through a long process right now around membership, for example, and that's the methodology we're using. The key, though, is to get business owners to buy into that as well, and that's the hardest part, and I would include the newsroom in that, and I'm talking senior managers, to get them out of the mindset of coming to product and technology with solutions or features in mind, and to start coming with problems that they would like to empower a group to solve on their behalf. And that group should be empowered to solve in any damn way they want to, as long as they solve the problem within reason. But that's sort of the magic place we're trying to get to, where that's kind of how we operate.
I think we'll take one more question, and then I think that's it. Somebody else? Amazing. Does anybody up here have something? Do you guys want to take a last pass, or should we call it? All right. I think we're done then. Thank you, everybody.
Yet, but I'm sure actually somebody I saw said at NPR, the question would be, how did they have 690 rubber bands at BuzzFeed? For those of you who don't know what we're talking about, we can talk about watermelons later. But in terms of product, I think the big challenge in any newsroom, whether you're for-profit or a public media organization or a nonprofit, is the notion of even discussing making a product. Some of us have been in journalism long enough to know that if you were discussing business and the business of your company, you were a horrible, unethical journalist. And how could you even think about such a thing? Because somehow magically you would do your brilliant journalism and not have to worry about how it's paid for, and that really wasn't your problem. Obviously, the whole industry has been turned upside down. I think as a journalist operating in today's environment, you're derelict in your duty if you do not think about the business side. You don't have to be fully involved, but you have to be aware of it. And come on, we're reporters. How can you live in a world where you watch the whole world economy turning upside down and you think somehow you are not going to be affected by it? So I think that that's something that everyone should be thinking about. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges in a newsroom, in thinking about creating a product. I think people just don't think that way, and they think it's not their job. I prefer to think about, yes, you know what, we know what people like about us, how are we going to double down on it? So in public media, we've created apps. I know most news apps are free, although some have paid content. That would be the equivalent of a product that I think would come out of technology, but the mistake people make is they don't include editorial. NPR had two great apps, the NPR News app and NPR One, which is labeled as a sort of Netflix for public radio, that NPR One would be able to figure out the things you liked and then basically programmed it by learning from you, what you listened to, what you passed on, what you thumbs up. And it's a great idea and a great product. And the thing that made it even better for the public radio system was that it could be localized. So we in the national at DC create an NPR One with NPR produced products. But if you're a station in Nebraska, there would be an opportunity for you to localize it for your audience. So if you're a listener listening to NPR One in Nebraska, you would hear an NPR News newscast at the top, and then something localized for you. Great idea, brilliant product.
I think our peers might purchase, or whole new customer bases that we haven't thought about in the past. So I've asked our panelists to talk a little bit about some of the things that they've been working on to try to address this problem, and particularly to focus on things that are coming out of the newsroom, rather than more sort of strategic or business level initiatives, that things that are really being generated by journalists themselves. So I think we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll let people talk about it. Does anybody want to start? All right, then we'll just go down the row here, I think.
I was just going to say, should we start with the definition of product?
Sure, that works for me.
Or should we start with the definition of who we all are?
Yeah. Oh. Well, I thought maybe we could you could introduce yourselves as you go.
Okay.
But that's fine.
Okay, I'm Madalika Sika. I am most recently, I was executive editor of Mike, which I just left. Prior to that, I was at NPR, where I was executive editor for news, and before that, executive producer for their morning radio show. Morning Edition, and prior to that I had an even longer time in network television, so I've run the gamut across all platforms. My sort of observations and insight on this issue are going to be dictated today mostly by the fact that I was in public media for a long time. For those of you unfamiliar with public media in the United States, it's free to the public. We never charge for any of our content. And it is funded by a combination of dollars from grants from the government, not a license fee like you have in many European countries, including Britain, philanthropic support, and something we call in the public media world underwriting, which you may be familiar with as advertising. The reason it's not called advertising is because there are very strict rules around the kind of language you can use in underwriting spots for public media. So, a Toyota ad that they would have across multiple news organizations probably wouldn't pass muster on public radio, so you'd have to create one just for us. So that's a bit of the background. And when we look at creating products, I think mostly for most of us in a for-profit world, we're talking about things that can be monetized. Public media is not averse to monetizing some things, but it's usually based from the journalism that we've done. So it just occurred to me thinking about this today that many years ago, NPR actually produced a lot of thematic CDs, which we would sell at the NPR store. So CDs built around great story, evergreen stories about dogs, or well, maybe not dogs, but evergreen stories around, art or culture or books. Haven't got to the watermelon.
All right, I think we're going to get started here. Hi, everybody. I am Celeste Lecomte, and I work at ProPublica, working on the business team there. And we are going to be talking about new product development in newsrooms today. So I want to start with a brief story, which is before I worked on the business side of media, I was a business reporter. And I reported a lot on innovation issues. So I interviewed many startups, and typically, one of the questions that I used to ask them all the time was, who are your customers going to be, and why will they give you their money? You may have a brilliant idea, but unless you have a product that somebody actually wants to buy, you don't really have a business. So as I started working more on the business side of media organizations, it occurred to me that we don't always do a very good job of asking this question of our own industry. Who are our customers and why will they give us their money? So as pretty much everyone here knows, I'm sure, the customers that we've depended on to give us their money for a long time, both our readers or viewers and our advertisers, are increasingly deciding not to give us their money. So I think that this is why we're at a moment in time in which we're starting to look at what are new products that our industry and that our companies can develop that people are willing to pay for, whether it's new kinds of advertising products that people are willing to pay for, whether it's new forms of content that are drawing different audiences that advertisers would like to meet with, whether it's tools that are coming out of the newsroom that we